Hi everyone. Today I wanted to make a little video because we're in the second lockdown here in the United Kingdom, and being back at Cambridge I have a lot of work to do, but I still want to produce videos. So I might do a few in this kind of style with just turning on the camera and talking to you about some of the things that I've been studying. And something that I recently delved into quite by accident was when I was writing an essay, which I'm going to make a video on as well, about defining the nature of sacred space for the Norse religion, was actually about what we call people who worship this religion. Now, most people will go straight away for a term like Norse paganism. And this is something that I have also done in the past. In my videos, I will refer to Norse paganism or Anglo-Saxon paganism, or perhaps as a more general term, Germanic paganism. And actually, I wanted to talk a little bit today about that term paganism, especially as it applies to people in the Viking Age worshipping, let's call it the traditional worship of the peoples of Northern Europe, especially of the Germanic peoples, and you might think of related peoples like the Balto-Slavs and the Finns and Celtic peoples as well, who before they converted to Christianity, as it happened, had a different belief set, which I've talked about in other videos. Now as well, you might find a term heathen that's also used for these people, and a lot of people today who will associate with this will call themselves heathen. Others will again just call themselves pagan. And actually more recently in academia, we've seen a term being used called pre-Christian or non-Christian. And actually in this video, I want to be that really annoying guy who sort of comes forward and says, all of these terms are pretty useless. Now, I'm not the kind of person to dictate the speech of anyone else, and I think it's perfectly valid for anyone to use these terms. But as someone in academia, I think we do need to carefully think about which terms we're using and always be thinking about whether we could be more specific or whether the terms that we're using are particularly loaded and might actually be clouding new thinking and new ideas and how we perceive what we're talking about by using these terms. And I think there is room for improvement when it comes to this. And I basically just wanted to turn on the camera to share some of, well, my points of view, and actually a lot of them are based on the work of Paul Sturtevant, who I've definitely said the name way too Dutch there because I doubt he's Dutch, but he wrote a very interesting article, which I'll link, called The Semantics of Viking Religion. And this is to look at these terms that we use when describing the religion, particularly of people in the Viking Age, and why some of these terms are quite lacking. And I was curious what you all thought about that. So his argument basically is based on the fact that these terms aren't brilliant because the first two were used during the period. Now, I've seen for myself in the comment section when I've talked about Vikings in the past, and you'll see this on almost any video that mentions Vikings, there will be people who say, you've used the term incorrectly. Actually, a Viking was someone, it's a verb to go Viking. Of course, we're looking at the Old Norse noun vikingar, perhaps at the time pronounced more like Wichinger, Wikinger. Wichinger is probably the Old English there that was being used, and that this has a very specific meaning, and that we should be careful to use the term Viking just when it applies to these seaborne raiders rather than to the entire group, which may better be called the Norse or Scandinavians. Now that's a topic for a different video, but actually the same can be said for pagan and heathen. Now, the etymology of the word pagan comes from the Latin paganus, and this is actually related to words such as pays or pays in French and Spanish, who are ultimately descended from Latin, and this means something to do with the countryside. So if you think in French, les Pays Bas are the Low Countries, los Países Bajos in Spanish, but paganus actually is an ancestor word for all of these terms, and this refers to someone of the country. The reason why this paganus has become associated with religion that isn't Christian is because during the time when the Romans converted to Christianity in Rome itself, outside of the city, many people continued to follow the ancient practice of idol worship and to worship the old gods. And that's why that religion then became associated with the countryside. And interestingly enough, you can draw many parallels to places in the Viking Age as well. A lot of the time it was urban centres, which may or may not have gone hand in hand with the fact that these were often also royal centres, and that it was a top-down conversion. So kings converted first, and then it went through to the aristocracy, the earls, and then through the rest of the population. But a lot of the time in the countryside, you still had people adhering to these older traditions and older religions. And eventually that kind of bleeds into what we now call folklore, which is very interesting in itself. But that's ultimately where the term paganus comes from. The thing with paganus is that it's always being used by Christians about other people in the past. So we don't actually get people referring to themselves as paganus. This is something that in more recent scholarship has become a bit of a problem, because a lot of the time when we're talking about other people, we're using the words that were being used not by them, but by other people about them. So it tells us more about how those other people felt about them or thought about them, rather than how these people viewed themselves. And that, of course, might colour our own perception when we think of a term like a pagan ritual as opposed to a Christian ritual. The pagan ritual isn't something that the pagans themselves would have described it as. So we might have certain connotations with that term. The term heathen, on the other hand, actually also very much follows the line of paganus, and in many ways it's just the Germanic variant of paganus. And this actually refers once again to someone who is rural. The term heathen connotes a heath dweller, so someone who dwells on the heath. And the first time this is used in a Germanic language is in the Gothic. It's in the translation of the Bible, when they, of course, refer to pagans as well. And the term that they use is the heathe. And this, again, of course, is a word for heath. The problem with heathen, for much the same reason as in pagan, again, it's a term that's being imposed on people, not being used by people. And I should add the caveat that it's not always possible to call people by what they call themselves, because a lot of the time we simply don't know and we don't have enough records. So this isn't me arguing from the corner of, well, we have to refer to them by what they call themselves, otherwise we're being rude to these people in the past. It's not really what I'm getting at here, but it's an important point to bear in mind a lot of the time. Just as today, if we use the common lingo of 19th century Americans towards Native Americans, and we just use the term savage, that might also colour our perception of them somewhat. So it might be a good idea to think about this when we're talking about other peoples further back in the past as well. Now, an issue with both of these terms, and there are several issues that are laid out with both of them, is that they are incredibly broad and unclear in their scope. Let me give you an example. I think pagan probably is the worst culprit of these two. But if you take the word pagan, you can really stretch that out, and actually it refers to a lot of different peoples over a really broad chronological space of time. So you might refer to the builders of Stonehenge as being pagans, and they frequently are. But at the same time, we might also refer to people still today living in Papua New Guinea as also being pagans, or to the Zulu as being pagans in the 19th century, for example. And this carries on all the way through history. But just because we're using the same term doesn't actually mean that those people who built Stonehenge thousands of years ago have anything in common with their belief set to people still alive in Papua New Guinea today, or to people who are resurrecting pagan beliefs here in Europe and in America and elsewhere in the world. Oftentimes they'll have pretty much nothing really specific in common, but we're just using this term because it's a handy sort of clumped together term that we can use for people who don't follow one of the recognized religions, let's call them. And this again is actually, the same way that Christians in the past who were writing down a lot of these sources also referred to these people and didn't really understand or care for the nuances between them. Whereas as people looking at the past and trying to better understand it, those nuances and details between groups of people and their belief set are incredibly important. And so that's why a term like pagan can be very difficult. Heathen works in very much the same way. I think fewer people would use the term heathen to refer to that many different people, and that might be because of its Germanic origin. So usually heathen is used in connection to, let's call them Germanic peoples and their belief set, rather than the term pagan, which is used a little bit broader. But even in the Sharp series, for example, and I'm pretty sure in sort of official empire lingo, they would often refer to people in India as heathens, let's say the Hindus, or elsewhere, the heathen remained a popular word. Now, these terms are difficult for that reason, because of the chronological, and I also kind of touched on the geographic scope that the term has too. Now, you might sort of then clarify and say, let's go, okay, so we're trying to sort a period, and we might say then Viking Age heathen or Viking heathen. Again, Viking is a very tricky term that's really been debated a lot now in how we're meant to use it, whether it's meant to be used in that sense as it was used initially, as much as we can know, because once again, no one who went Viking wrote it down. So no one ever described themselves as a Viking that we can see, apart from, I think, 1 or 2 runic inscriptions that actually describe people going out. But we have very few people who say, I went Viking and that's what I am. Once again, a lot of the time it's being written down afterwards, and it's being written down by people who were not involved in that kind of thing. So that's worth bearing in mind. The term Scandinavian as well is tricky, because we also have another group of people that would fall under this huge bracket of pagan, which are the Sami. And their belief set, well, there are some very interesting comparisons, which I'll touch on at some point in the future, I'm sure, really is very separate from what the people in Scandinavia further south, so the Norse, what they were worshipping and what they were doing. So again, that term isn't great. So then we come to one that has been favored more in academia, and I think this is because there was a movement away from using the same terms that were being used during the period itself and afterwards to describe these people by Christians who oftentimes had a narrative and a kind of agenda to portray them in a certain way, and that has led to certain connotations, just as the word pagan today in a lot of Europe and North America, when it's being used, you might have kind of a blended idea. You might think of a pentagram and of Wicca. Perhaps you'll think of the more Norse tradition that's being resurrected there as well. But it has so many connotations in public use, which is one of my arguments for why I think using Viking strictly in the way that it was used historically in the Middle Ages is a bit of a problem, because, well, it's used so frequently in so many different contexts today with a very large semantic field surrounding it, that it would be very tricky to sort of steer that all back into exactly the way that we think it was being used in the Middle Ages. Now, the term pre-Christian, while it sounds more academic because you're not including one of these terms that often was used in a negative way about these people, it also is quite flawed, and this is for the same reason as pagan and heathen, because once again, you're just substituting that term for a chronological term. And the problem with having pre-Christian is that it's quite teleological in its approach, and this is to say that there was always a chosen end goal. Not only does this take away from the agency of people, many of whom fought very hard and many of whom died, let's not forget, in the fight against being converted. That's not to say all of them. Lots of people probably converted because they wanted to. Some may even have been genuinely religiously convicted and decided to convert to Christianity. It's a very mixed bag, and I don't want to make any generalizations here. But there were a lot of people that were very strongly opposed to that and held on to it, and we have a lot of accounts of people being killed and forcefully converted. So framing it in that way, it seems a little unfair to have pre-Christian in this kind of, that there was a before Christian and a Christian conversion and then after Christian, because we know that that wasn't the case either. We have a period of syncretism where people will have worshipped the traditional gods and in the traditional manner, and also adopted Christian practices. And actually a lot of festivals, especially in Catholicism, Protestantism, tended to get rid of quite a few of them because of sola scriptura, which is just what's in the Bible. And of course, there's not an awful lot of Northern European traditions that have ended up, that were written down in the Bible. I wonder why. But a lot of these traditions carried on into the Middle Ages, and actually some of them quite far, and that's what we now refer to as folklore a lot of the time. A lot of that, not all of it, has its origins in these practices that were worshipped and followed before this conversion to Christianity. So that's a bit of a problem, because we one, neglect this period of syncretism and the idea that people could have followed multiple belief sets, and that there was a binary of non-Christian and Christian. And also because pre-Christian, once again, you could use it for Celtic Ireland, you could use it for people in Ethiopia, you can again use it for people in Papua New Guinea, all over the place. You could use it for Muslims, Moors in Spain in the 17th century. It's incredibly huge, and it once again tries to define it negatively by comparing it to something else rather than sort of describing it in its own right, which is important. I think it would be like describing the Frisians during this period as non-Frankish. Why not just say Frisian at that point? Why would we then have something negative to define it against when we could just actually define that term? Now, rather than me just sitting here and postulating about these terms and saying, well, we should define it by what the term is, like, well, but what actually is the term? Now, I haven't actually thought of the answer, but our boy Paul here did think of an answer and a different term that can be used. And I wanted to read a little bit of this essay, if you'll forgive me, because I think it's rather interesting as well for what we describe it as. Now, I've used the term religion a few times here, but we're not actually sure if religion is the best term to be using for this belief set. Once again, because we, in the 21st century, have a very clear idea of what we think of as religion. Now, obviously, some people might have slight variations in what they see as religion, but most of us will think that it involves some kind of deity, a lot of the time some kind of standardized practice, whether that is performing puja as a Hindu, whether that's going to the church on Sunday or going to the mosque on Friday. You know, we have a similar idea of what we mean by religion, no matter whether we are religious or which denomination we might belong to today, for the vast majority of people, that is. However, if we look back at the past, especially in the Viking Age, and for people with this belief set, there is not so much a distinction that we can make. So today we might see, well, in the United Kingdom certainly, that the legal system, the courts, and the government are quite famously divided from the church. There is a separation of church and state. But actually, I think for the Viking Age, that goes even further, in that there is nothing, you can't separate the two. So to read a little bit of the next section that I wrote in this essay on sacred space, I said, the belief set of the Viking Age Norse would best fall into the category of a non-doctrinal community religion, as opposed to Christianity, which might be termed a doctrinal transnational religion. In his 2012 article on the semantics of Viking religion, Sturtevant offered Norse polytheism as a valid replacement. And this will be the term that is used henceforth to describe the belief set followed by the Norse before the conversions to Christianity during the Viking Age. Quoting an earlier argument made by Biller, Sturtevant also emphasized that even such a basic term as religion may not be the right one to use when talking about Norse polytheism. It's not until the early modern period that it came to mean a religion or religions, like the Christian religion, Jewish religion, and so on, a system or systems. And by using religion with its modern connotations to refer to something that in the past was not viewed in the same way, can misdescribe and attribute to men in the past what was, to them, inconceivable. And therefore, it might be something that will obscure rather than put into focus a study into the places held as sacred by these people. The closest term we find in Old Norse to what we would describe as religion is sithir, and this occupies the semantic space somewhere between ways and customs and culture. And the more modern notion of religion doesn't appear to have been conceived of as being markedly different from what we would describe as secular culture. And that's something that I talked about more throughout this essay in looking at sacred spaces and which spaces were considered sacred by people of what Sturtevant refers to as Norse polytheism. So Norse polytheists, to describe those worshippers, which he felt was a better term to be using, because then you don't exclude this idea of syncretism between them, You've also denoted which cultural group you're talking about, as well as a historic period. So you've got the Norse in there, the polytheism from poly, which is Greek denoting more, multiple, and theist, which is related to Latin deus, which is God, so multiple gods within that religion. So I think that's a better term to be using. And that's what Paul Sturtevant also thought would be a better term, because then you're describing it positively, so by its own merits, rather than negatively comparing it to Christianity, and you're not using a term that has these connotations, and it might be considered loaded today when looking at the historic record. Or perhaps we're all being overly sensitive and ridiculous, and everyone knows that the term pagan doesn't necessarily refer to bloodthirsty rituals and savage people, and we just need to grow a pair and get on with it. Which is a perfectly acceptable response, by the way. That's completely fine. And you can write that in the comments below. But I thought it was a very interesting argument. It's not something that I had particularly considered before, and that's why I just kind of gone for using the term pagan. I'm not even aware if I use the term heathen in any of my other videos. Quite possibly have at some point. But I thought this was an interesting point of view, and I'll see if I stick to using the term Norse polytheism, because after having read Sturtevant's article, I did go on to use that term throughout this essay, because I thought it was rather fitting. So yeah, let me know in the comments below. I'd be curious to see. I might try and set up some kind of poll and get back to you. But anyway, I'll make some more videos like this. Let me know if you liked the format or if you absolutely hated it. And